everybody, it's Bert and welcome to Season 2, Episode 2 of Building an Exocet with Bert and Friends. So, today, very straightforward. We are going to work on putting on the fuel line. We're going to do the wiring harness going to the back of the Exocet. We're also going to do the brake lines going to the back of the Exocet. And we are going to remove the power steering system from obviously the front of the car. We're going to do all this. It's going to be relatively straightforward, very simple. So don't get overwhelmed, don't overthink it. The power steering system, what we're going to in essence do is we're going to remove the pump, all of the tubing, and then we're going to reroute the inlet and outlet tubing that actually goes into the steering rack. Do a very simple delete. It deletes a lot of the unnecessary junk that we don't need. The chassis with body is only going to weigh about 1,400 pounds, so we won't need it. And at that point then, once we get all that crap taken out, we'll start redoing a little bit of the brake work and making sure that everything's lined up. We're also going to redo the studs on the front wheels here. We have not installed the longer APR studs in order to use the larger wheels and the hub-centric spacers. Remember, use hub-centric spacers if you're going to get them, and make sure your wheels have hub-centric rings. Otherwise, you're going to have trouble. Okay, everybody, so right now we are here at the front of the Exocet. The first thing we're actually going to do is delete the power steering system. So we'll go ahead and unhook the power steering pump. The serpentine belt and all that stuff's already been unhooked, so we're not worried about that. There's actually, I think, technically two serpentine belts on this thing. Oh god, that's dirty. And what we're going to do is we're going to obviously unhook the power steering pump, all the tubing that goes with it. There's going to be two banjo bolts. Technically, I think they're just large banjo bolts that are going to be going into the actual steering rack. So in the back of the pump, you got a long bolt that goes in through here into the front. It's a 14 millimeter. Go ahead and undo that, and then you got a small sensor right here. Go ahead and pull that off, and the whole pump will actually wiggle, and it'll wiggle itself out. It's a bit of a tight fit, but it'll come out. Come on, baby. Come on. There we go. And there you go. Your steering pump's off. There's also a single bolt up here at the top, which runs the tensioner. It's a little bit blurry, but it's this guy right here. And once you unhook that, you're pretty much done. It took me all of 30 seconds to actually unhook this. And now what we're going to do is go ahead and start undoing some of these pressure clamps and get this whole thing pulled out of here. Alrighty, go ahead and take these clamps off here, slide these down, and we're going to wiggle it until they come apart. Shouldn't be too difficult. And yes, there is power steering fluid in this. I just got it all over myself. Good job, Bert. Making a mess already. Not like that's not unusual. And we've got one more back here. Go ahead and pull that up. Wiggle the same tube. This is the same tube, obviously. Now, we want to make sure that we protect as much as possible below this. Go ahead and do that. So I'm going to take a rag, and I'm going to use that to hopefully not make as much of a mess. And what we've got here is we've got the entire steering rack pulled out of the Exocet, and we're actually going to completely dismantle it and do the proper delete. Now, there's a lot of videos on YouTube of how to properly go about doing this. Best way I can tell you is you pull it apart and you literally strip it down to almost every single component. That's really the best way to do it. Once you end up getting it all pulled apart, and I'm actually going to leave a couple links to other videos in the description that I found very, very useful and helpful as to how to do this, because I had no idea what I was doing. But really there's two things you have to do. You have to get a hold of this guy here. This is actually two individual pieces, and this is where the steering rack actually attaches to the actual steering wheel here. You have to weld this up, and some people weld it, some people use like blue or red Loctite, and that seems to get rid of all the play. My main concern is obviously having this possibly break, because it's a power steering module. It's not necessarily designed for the same amount of torques as, you know, a non-powered unit, and we might be thrashing this thing pretty hard, so it would probably be very helpful to go ahead and weld this anyway. Then over there, which I will show you, I actually have the tube that has all the splines on it that this feeds into. There's a little washer that you have to cut off that I will show you, and pretty much cut that, weld this, and then you just put it all back together and put it in. Really, it's not that complicated. I'm working with some really nasty stuff, so I'm not going to go over this in intimate detail just because I'd get my camera completely covered in crap, and I really don't want to do that. So I'm going to go ahead and show you what I'm dealing with over there. I'm going to go ahead and cut that, weld this, and we're going to put it back together. Now here is the actual shaft that goes inside of the wheel, and this is our main culprit right here. We got to cut that guy off. Once you cut that off, then everything's freely able to move and there's no more of a vacuum, so you don't have to really worry about steering resistance, and that's what everybody's worried about. So just take an angle grinder, cut that off. This guy here, actually, I will mention, pulling this off was single-handedly the most difficult nut I've ever had to deal with in my life. It actually split a couple times, and it's a real pain in the ass. So be careful with it, take your time. I had to actually go out and get a larger vise and adjustable wrench just to take this thing off, but it was a monster. Other than that, the rest of it actually came apart pretty easily. So now what I'm gonna do is I'm gonna cut this, and I'm gonna weld the other part, and then we should be good to go. Alrighty guys, so now as we can see right here, we've actually cut off the metal ring that was on here. So now we've got clean movement, so we shouldn't have to worry about anything blocking or having any resistance whenever the depowered steering system is working. Couple nicks in it, it's not gonna hurt it. This is 1 inch plus thick steel, so there'll never really be any force on it that'll cause this to be a problem. So now what we're gonna do is go ahead and put all this back together, but I have to weld that first part as well. Now for the next part, we have to go ahead and weld this guy right here. This is, again, where the pinion goes into the actual steering rack, and then the steering wheel actually attaches up here. But you need to go ahead and weld this, because this is actually 2 separate components, and it could possibly break under a really heavy load, and I wouldn't want that. Everybody else says to weld it, so we're not gonna take any chances with the single most important part that actually controls the Exocet. So now what we're gonna do is go ahead and weld this. And here we go. We have our 2 pieces for the steering assembly that are now welded together. The welds aren't the greatest. Again, I'm using like an $80 welder from Harbor Freight, but the welds are strong, and I made sure everything was properly cleaned and my voltage was good. So we now have a properly welded steering gimbal. I don't know really what this thing's even called, but now what we're gonna do is we're gonna go ahead and put everything back together. This here is the nut, if you want to call it that, that made my life a living hell for like 2.5 hours. This thing was unbelievably difficult to get off, but hopefully it goes on with little difficulty, because I would really like that about it. So now, what we're working on is taking out the old studs and putting in new ARP studs. Now, these are for Mazda Miata. They're ARP 1007719. And it even says front only for 94 to 05, and then front rear for 99 to 93. So the back ones are actually different than the fronts. And if you go back and watch the older video where we did that, you'll actually see when I talk about them. So we're gonna go ahead and just take a hammer and bang these guys out. And they come out with relative ease. The new ones are going to be really a pain in the ass to get in, like the other ones were. So you may end up having to buy a special tool. Me, I'm just going to use some old sockets and a breaker bar to sink them back in, because these do have threads on them. But it's not a difficult exercise. It's just a very long, tiresome pain in the butt. So let's get into it. All right, so at this point we have the extended ARP studs on the actual hub. Best way I found to do this is once you knock the old ones out, feed the new ones through, tighten them down as best you can with an impact gun if you have one, put the rotor on, put the old wheel on, and then put a nut on either side for 2 bolts at a time. And the old Miata bolts, actually the lugs, worked just fine. They have these little metal caps on them. They broke through, no big deal. And you just use these and you tighten that tire on as much as you can using a breaker bar and a really deep, what is this? This is a 21 millimeter 6-point socket, and it pulled those bolts right through, nice and flush and tight. Took me about 10 minutes to do all of them. Now that I've figured out how to do this, I wish I would have done that on the back side, because it took me a heck of a lot longer to do it back there. So now what I'm going to do is put the caliper on, put the wheel on, and then we're going to go over and work on the other side. So again, best way to do it, feed them through, they'll be loose, put the rotor on, put the wheel on, and then just crank the hell out of the old metal, the old iron lug nuts here, the old steel lug nuts, and they'll just pull them right on through. So, yeah, pretty simple, straightforward. I really wish I would have known that ahead of time. But, let's go ahead and put the rest of this back together. 15 millimeter hub-centric ring spacers. Go ahead and slide them right on. There we go, and she's on. Okay, so there's been a bit of a development that I've realized in my infinite stupidity, since I really have no idea what I'm doing. The larger brake rotors and brake kit from the Mazda Speed Miata or Mazda Sport that was not standard will not work. Yes, for those of you who have been trolling me about that, yes, you were correct. For a reason that we actually didn't foresee. Basically, the rims are not large enough for it to fit inside of. I feel kind of like that episode of Top Gear when they had that Renault Aventine and they brought the really big brakes and then they put the really small rims over it. Unfortunately, it's just, the way it is. I did speak with Kevin Patrick, the guy who designed the Exocet. What he said is, just go back with the standard brakes. You're not going to really need any super increased performance. Yes, the larger brakes do look cool and you can get them to work. But if you need zero offset wheels, you can't use them. And because in Georgia, you don't need them, I'm kind of screwed. So fortunately, I still have all the old brakes and that's sitting in in a box. So what I figure what we'll end up doing is, since we have a Torsen limited slip differential and we have the extra large brake kit, when we build our next racing Miata or whatever we want, maybe make an off-road or rally Miata, which would be really cool, which is actually something I want to do, we may use it for that. Probably wouldn't be a bad idea. But at this point, I went and I ordered normal brake rotors for this that will reuse the same standard hardware that it came with. And I just feel like a really big dummy. But sometimes things like this happen, and I will tell anybody, if you're building an Exocet, you're going to buy parts you're probably not going to need. And it's going to happen. You're going to break stuff. I'll be perfectly honest, the rack and pinion, there's a large bolt. It's like a weird nut that's hollow. It's a very, it tormented me. I actually shattered the damn thing putting it back in just because of how large it is and how tight the fit was. So I broke the rack and pinion. Not cool. It'll cost me $75 to get another one from the junkyard, which they're pulling. So I'm not happy about that. But the truth is, you're going to break stuff. You're going to have parts you don't need. So welcome to the party. And those of you who said, hey, you don't need larger brakes, you've already cut the weight by 1,000 pounds roughly, you're welcome. So now that I'm done kicking myself, we're going to go ahead and back to taking the small studs off of the driver's side. I'm going to show you guys exactly how I did it and a little bit more detail, because last night when I was working on it, I was really tired, a bit cranky, because I realized I totally screwed up. So now let's go ahead and see how easy it is, which actually it is very easy to swap out the studs. You don't even need to buy special tools, and I'll show you how to do it. Alrighty, so first thing we want to do is go ahead and take off. I basically just had these hand tightened, no big deal. And for 1007719. It even says on here specifically what it's for, and it says Mazda Miata. There you go. That's what you'll need. Now, there's a couple different ways you can go about doing this. I'm going to go ahead and use the old lug nuts. All right, a couple of the old lug nuts here. Take a really large socket, and we're just going to thread this on. Now, the reason I have this here is it's acting as a stopgap. What it'll do is it'll help pull this through. And then I need a slightly larger head. It's that guy right there. Don't use any 12-point socket parts, otherwise you're going to end up ruining stuff and you'll end up stripping bolts. It's generally a bad idea. This is just designed to get it started. Did I just kill the battery? Yeah. All right. And while then it's not in super tight, it's just holding it. I do that again. I think my battery's a little dead. So now what we're going to do is we're going to go ahead and put some lug nuts on these. And what these lug nuts will end up doing is pulling the studs through that back plate. Make sure you use a deep well socket. You're going to want to use a 21 millimeter for these stock ones. We'll go ahead and lock them down. Yep. Now all we do is take the breaker bar, we go ahead and we tighten them in. That's about it. Yep. Make sure your wheel doesn't spin. Alrighty, so now we've got our 4 studs here. They are securely fastened. The back plates, everything is nice and flush, which is what you want to make sure. If need be, pull off your rotor and double check, make sure each one is seated properly. I actually also put a little bit of Loctite on these just for a good measure. So now we'll go ahead and put the rotor on. Now yes, this is the big rotor that we will unfortunately not be using, but the new rotors won't be here for a couple hours. So in the meantime, I'm at least going to put this back together so that everything is out of the way and I don't have more crap sitting around that I need. There we go. And now we have all 4 of our new wheels on. Just that the camber and everything is completely off, but you know, there's nothing we can really do about that right now. So now that we've got those taken care of, I'm going to go unpack the rest of the old brake system and wait for the new stuff to come in, and once it's here we will start swapping pieces out. In the meantime, let's go ahead and get started on running the electrical through the PPF to the back of the Exocet. And now it's time to answer a subscriber question. I don't usually do these on camera, but I have a question here from Diego Sabariani. Probably I'm butchering the hell out of that, so I apologize. He's in Australia, and it says, do you have to remove the exhaust to get the shell off, or did you guys only do it because you are swapping it out? I need to keep the original for the initial registration process. I would really like to have it on, as I know how hard they can be to take off. So, no, you don't need to take it off. You will need to unhook everything, but it's not really actually attached to the body at all. The one thing I will tell you though is the stock exhaust on the Miata is like 16 inches longer than the actual Exocet because you don't have your trunk and all that stuff. So while you can reuse a lot of it, it will look really, really bad. So you're going to want to modify your muffler and do some custom work at the back end. Most people do. That, going with what we're working on, right now we're not going to be doing forced induction, but we do have a Racing Beats header that we got, so we'll just custom engineer something. The exhaust is one of those areas where you can do whatever you want. You can use the stock stuff. It's not going to look right. It's going to work, should work just fine, but it's going to look really weird. You're going to have this big old, it's going to look like a horse dong on Derby Day kind of hanging out the back end, and you really, really don't want that. And then the other question I have is, I'm also buying a Mishimoto radiator, just double checking that it is the NA model radiator and fans I buy for the Exocet. So we ended up buying one that was able to work with both the NA and the NB. Now the problem with the Exomotive mounts is that it's designed for the NA. The Exocet was designed for the NA Miata, but they don't really differ a whole lot for some of the more important stuff, but some of the small stuff like wiring, some things are a little bit different. And the radiator, they went with obviously a larger radiator for the NB. And the mounts that they have are very, very different. Now what you can do is just get a regular NA Mishimoto radiator, and that should work just fine with all the mounts. And then you can just rivet them on and plug them in like I showed you guys in the earlier video a couple episodes back. Or you can get an NB and you can custom make some mounts. I have some mounts here that I custom made. I also 3D printed a couple prototypes here that I was going to send off to Exomotive, so that if anyone does have an NB radiator, you can just use that. But you know, that's neither here nor there, and I've got to pick that up. Use whatever radiator you want. If you want to use an NA and have seamless transition, best way to go. Your pipes and everything will fit. Mishimoto's radiators are really good. I'm not plugging for them, I'm just saying they're good. I was extremely impressed with the engineering quality, and they have a lifetime warranty, which is like really cool because I love that kind of stuff. But other than that, I don't have any other answers for you right now, Diego. I give you the best of luck with your Exocet, and it's probably going to take quite a while to get to you if you're in Australia. So send us pictures whenever you're whenever you get it, because that'd be really cool to see an Exocet cruising around Australia, especially if it was like an off-road model. That would be really, really cool. This would make a really cool rally car, but probably would be really dirty. Anyway, I digress. That's all I've got for answering people's questions. Other than that, if you have any questions on the Exocet, feel free to ask me. I will respond to your email very, very quickly, or I may end up putting it into a video like this. So, that being said, let's get back to it.
So we have the spacers, and we're going to use these to attach the shocks to the Exocet chassis here. We're getting ready to start assembling the rear suspension, as it's all here, subframe to body. The fun is about to begin. So when you get these spacers, and we're going to start here with the rear, when you look at them, you can see that one side is fatter than the other one's a little bit thinner. You can also mark these by they have some miscellaneous holes on through the other side. So when you have these, and your kind of gut instinct first thing's going to tell you is the fat side goes out, because the chassis over here kind of comes up at an angle, but in fact it actually goes the other way around. So
guys, flip it upside down quick.
Yep. So you've got the end with a larger plate. That's going to be what goes down, and then you've got the taller end, and that goes in towards the center side. So bolt up, and up it goes. And then as this is here and hanging, we will bring our second bolt into action.
And it's worth mentioning that the little indentations for the cuts are actually on the bottom and facing out, because I'll attach a picture from Exomotive that makes it a lot clearer. But this is something that can be easily screwed up, and you don't want to go out on the road with these on wrong, because that would probably be bad.
Now, as we can see from this picture here, the back spacer, which is highlighted in orange, this is the correct orientation. So you want to pay very close attention to this picture whenever you mount your rear spacers, otherwise you're going to be redoing it several times. Now in this picture, this is actually the way the bolts are not supposed to go. Some people have had this kind of a problem, and if you have that kind of a problem, it's because your top bolt is actually meant to go up, and you may end up having to trim a little bit off the top bolt that actually goes onto the coilover. Now this is for the front spacer. Now as you can see from the geometry of this, it's also not highlighted, but that is the way it is supposed to go. That would be on technically the left side, driver's side in the US. The next picture will give you a more clear picture. That is how they're meant to be spaced and meant to go. If you end up putting it on wrong, I don't think it'll actually fit properly, so the front one's very hard to put on upside down, but you can accidentally switch them from left to right, so be very careful when doing so.
So for the front spacer, you've got this one here. Now it goes on a very specific way. Larger portion is going to be on the bottom. You're going to have this little knob here. It's going to be facing backwards. So make sure whenever you put it on that it sits just like so. You go ahead and you take your bolts, put one on, and you fit it up underneath. Now there is an adjustable portion for your shock spacer, and it's going to have a bit of a swoop, and that allows you to adjust your camber, if I remember correctly. Or just your...
More than likely, that's probably toe.
Toe? Okay. Now, for doing the spacer here, we're just going to keep the same mentality. Have the bolt facing up, just like the back. Other people say you can do the bolt down. I'm just trying to keep it as uniform. You can do however you like, but on the back, you will have to make sure that the bolt is actually going up and the nut is on the top. Otherwise, your shock spacers aren't going to work. You're also going to have to trim the bolts on the head of the actual shock itself by about 4 to 5 millimeters. Most people end up doing that. It's unavoidable, so just take an angle grinder and just grind that off, and you'll make sure that they fit. Otherwise, you're going to have a bad day. Simply feed this up through the bottom here, in through those 2 points. Put our shock mount bolts here together, and we've got these mounted. Now at this point, what you can do is you can start putting your chassis down. There's a lot of different ways to go about actually dropping your chassis onto the subframe. With this, you can have a couple people help you with it. You can use an engine hoist. If you have a lift, lucky you. What we're probably going to end up doing is, what do you think?
So with the resources that we have at hand, what we're going to do is initially we're going to pull the subframes up to the body as it's sitting up on the stands right now. So we're going to get the subframes up, attach the subframes on, and then essentially work on everything with the droop of the control arms, kind of just push them up, get the shocks attached here. So at this point, we are going to try and get these subframe bolts in through.
All right, so there's 2 subframe bolts on each side. We're gonna have to undo those because I made sure they didn't come up. Alrighty, now for going ahead and mounting the chassis on the front to the subframe, you just want to try and wiggle this around until you get it to align. All right, front. Okay, so at this point, we've actually mounted the 4 bolts on the front to the chassis to the subframe. Now comes the back 2 bolts that I showed you guys before, because there's a total of 8. There's the 2, which are right here in the front, and then you got another 2 that go through back here, and then through a bar that is right about there. So what we're going to do now is we're going to go ahead, and Doug is going to mount those bolts.
All right, so 2 different size bolts that are going to go down through. We've got a short guy here. This one is going to be the frontmost bolt through the subframe that goes up here, and then we've got the longer one, and this one is going to go through the backside bolt, which obviously has a lot more depth to go through. Obvious reason why we're using that one. So long one down through, short one down through, and then we're going to take our washer and our nylon lock nut, and those are just going to mate right up to it.
And obviously you have 2 on each side, so you got 2 there, and then you got 2 more over there. And then once we get that done, we will go ahead and we will move to the back. So anyway, guys, that is the end of episode 2. Thank you for joining me today. I really appreciate everyone staying by us and watching all of our videos here, and subscribing and commenting, because it really does mean a lot to us. If you'd like to join us and become a Patreon, feel free to do that. We would love your support. And as always, I am Bert from Pixel Armory. Like, favorite, subscribe, and I'll see you guys next time.
And I want to do a huge shout out to Patrick O'Connor, Nico Dashe, Evan Lansinski, and Jack Allen for being our awesome Patreon subscribers. Thank you so much for your donations, guys. It really does mean a lot to us here at the channel that everyone can support us and that you guys are behind us. Thank you from the bottom of all of our hearts here at Pixel Armory. And as always, I am Bert. Stay safe, and I'll see you guys real soon.